Hello and welcome back to Understanding American Government. Today's topic is the election process. First, let's talk about who takes part in elections, and before that, let's talk about who does not take part. In early America, a lot of people were not able to vote. The right of suffrage, the right to vote, was generally only given to wealthy Christian white men. It was really up to each state to decide, but they all had their restrictions. And one estimate is that only 6% of the country was able to vote in our first presidential elections. African Americans faced a long struggle for the right to vote, and then a longer struggle to actually make that vote happen. Many southern states for a long time tried to keep black voters away. States would charge you a tax to vote, which many African Americans couldn't afford, or states would make you pass a reading and a citizenship test first. And if the voter was white, it would be an easy test. But if the voter was black, it would be very detailed and very difficult. Oh, and the black voter probably was never educated anyway. Or states would use what they called the grandfather clause, saying that you could vote only if your grandfather could vote. For many African Americans, their grandfather was a slave and could not vote, so they too were kept from voting. The civil rights movement of the 1960s went a long way toward fixing this. Many new laws were passed to make voting more accessible to all citizens, though there is still pushback to equal voting. Even today, some conservative states are trying to pass voter ID laws that would effectively keep many minorities from voting. Women were given the right to vote in 1920, when the 19th Amendment was passed. This was opposed by many people for many different reasons. Liquor producers were afraid this would lead to banning alcohol, and it did kind of. And Southern whites were afraid this would lead to black women being able to vote too, and it did, of course. Felons are also not usually allowed to vote while they're in prison or on probation, and a few states bar felons from voting for life. This has generally had a larger effect on the African American population, and so has helped many conservative candidates in states with largely black populations. Especially after the 2000 presidential election, many people called for the election process to be changed. In 2000, George W. Bush won the presidency, though Al Gore won more popular votes, and the election was finally decided based on one state, Florida. Many people, especially poor African Americans, felt that their votes had been ignored or deliberately not counted. This pushed Congress to make some changes in the way presidential votes happen, including updating voting machines and setting clear and fair rules for vote counts and recounts. These rules could have changed the outcome of the presidential election in Florida in 2000. What about voter turnout? That's the term we use to describe how many people actually go vote, and it's changed a lot over the years. At the end of the 19th century, the people's interest in politics was very high, and a lot of people took part by voting. Like we talked about last chapter, political parties played a big role in people's lives, and this got a lot of regular folks to vote. As voting reforms made the process seem more legit, this actually reduced the number of people voting. Since they were now less reliant on party power, people became less likely to vote. In the 20th century, we've seen a shift again. In the middle decades of the century, voter turnout was above 60%. But at the end of the 1900s, voter turnout dropped to the point that less than half of the total population now votes. However, in recent years, Obama has motivated new groups of voters, especially young people and African Americans, who have become more active in politics. Who are these voters? Who votes? There are a lot of factors that impact how likely a person is to vote. People with more education and higher income are more likely to vote. In the past, older people were more likely to vote than younger people, but recently this is beginning to change. There are other factors, but these factors like gender, race, and geography change frequently. So why is voter turnout so low in our country? People have tried hard to figure that out. It doesn't seem to have anything to do with satisfaction or dissatisfaction with the government. Over the years, this hasn't mattered. A relevant factor, though, seems to be that people are turned away from the negative culture surrounding politics. There is so much negative campaigning and name-calling, and a lot of political offices have a bad reputation anyway. A lot of voters think it's not worth the effort to vote, If I'm just one person, what influence can I possibly have? On top of this, a lot of people don't see any meaningful difference between the parties. They all just seem like more politicians. Also, people in America move around a lot. We are less rooted to one place, and this lack of roots seems to reduce voting. It's also the fault of political parties, who in the past have focused a lot on their message and their ideas and less on convincing people to go vote. Also, unions are no longer as active in getting voters out. And some conservative states still make it very difficult for poor people or for minorities to vote or even to register to vote. And some voting districts are arranged so that they will virtually always go for one party. This is called gerrymandering, and though it's common for a party to draw voting districts this way, it reinforces the idea that an individual vote doesn't matter. All these reasons add up to people not wanting to vote. Who runs for president? Mostly senators and governors, though regular private citizens run too. They all tend to be very wealthy. In the 1900s, all but 4 presidents were millionaires when they took office. A candidate has to be officially nominated by their party before they can take part in the election. This is because there will only be one person from each party running for an office, usually. Part of what helps them win is just getting their name out. People are more likely to vote for someone they've heard of. Candidates also push one idea or issue, and if voters are really interested in that issue, that will help them become the nominee. For the presidency, the candidates are chosen by the party delegates. But before the delegates show up at the conventions, there are caucuses and primaries to help choose between candidates. Say there are 8 people running for the Democratic nomination for president. They will be narrowed down to one winner in the primaries, which are early elections, usually open just to the party members to decide the official nominee for the general election. Some states instead have caucuses, which are sort of neighborhood meetings that end with everyone voting for a candidate. Both primaries and caucuses have problems with them, and they both tend to only bring out the people most extreme on the political spectrum, not moderates. After the primaries and caucuses have taken place, the major parties will have their conventions when they officially announce who will run for president from their party. These conventions used to be more important when the parties had more direct influence on who the nominee was. But now the conventions are mostly big parties, meant to get people excited for the general election. The party still announces the candidate, but by that point it has already been decided in the primaries. So what about the vice president? The job of vice president varies a lot from one president to the next. Some VPs are very active. A lot of people saw Vice President Cheney as being just as powerful as President Bush, but others do very little. Vice presidential candidates are often chosen for their ability to balance a ticket. That means that if a presidential candidate is relatively young, like Obama, then his running mate will likely be someone relatively less young, like Joe Biden. Or if a candidate has little experience in national politics, like George W. Bush, his running mate might be someone with a lot of experience in Washington, like Cheney. Most people agree, though, that the choice of a vice presidential candidate really doesn't do much to help in an election. And as always, there are a few exceptions to this. Alright, now the primaries are over, and it's time for the general elections. For presidential candidates, this applies to the whole country, while for Senate candidates, it applies to only one state, and for House candidates, it applies to only part of one state. But for all these, the goals of this campaign are the same: to get new voters to like you, and to get your old voters back out to vote for you again. Many states are heavily liberal or heavily conservative, and they can pretty much be counted on to vote that way. These states don't see many campaign ads. Most campaigning is in swing states or swing districts. These are the states that could go for either party. In these campaigns, the candidates try to get their image out and promote whatever issue they've latched onto that they think will attract voters. Most of this is done through advertising. And most of this advertising happens, of course, on television. This is hugely expensive, and so one big factor in who gets elected to any office is who has the most money to spend. Candidates do a lot of research, trying to guess how their ads will best connect with voters in one specific place. Because campaign ads can be very precise. using slightly different messages in different parts of the state or country to attract the most voters. The types of ads that most people are the most familiar with are negative ads, or sometimes called attack ads. These are exactly what they sound like. They're designed to make the other candidate look like a bad choice. In the last few years, there's been a big increase in e-campaigning, or sending campaign messages through email or text. This seems like an obvious option to us, but it's really only common among younger voters. One benefit of this is that it lets the candidate send very specific messages based on a very small audience, hence the name micro-targeting. Besides buying campaign ads on television, candidates also get their name out by appearing on talk shows and other live TV shows. This is good for the candidate because it's usually free advertising for them, and it's good for the voters too. It seems like a more personal view of the candidate and a good way to get to know them. Don't be fooled. These are still carefully scripted events, and the candidate is showing only the image they want to show. After all this campaigning, we finally get to vote. But in presidential elections, there are really two votes. First, the people vote for their choice. This is called the popular vote, when everyone goes to the polls. After this, there's the second vote, which is not done by regular people, but by the Electoral College. The Electoral College is a group that decides how each state as a whole will vote. See, the Founding Fathers didn't want the common person deciding who would be president. They wanted the elite to do that. Today, these elite members of the Electoral College agree to vote to follow their state's popular vote. There have been a few times when the winner of the Electoral College vote did not win the popular vote, though. This means that the presidential candidate who got the most people to vote for him did not win the election. This happened most recently in 2000, some system, right? After this election, in which George W. Bush lost the popular vote but still became president, many people called for voting reform, but this hasn't happened yet. Most experts have identified three big factors in how someone votes. First is their party choice. Most often people just follow their party. But it also has to do with what they think of the individual candidates. If voters like one candidate's style, he will probably do well. And some voters are single-issue voters, and they will give their vote to whatever candidate agrees with them on that one issue. This ongoing evaluation of candidates has led to what we call the permanent campaign. This refers to the fact that every time campaigns begin earlier before the election, to the point that it seems like they never stop. There are many reasons for this, and most experts agree that it won't change anytime soon. The permanent campaign is here to stay. Well, that's it for this chapter. Good luck on the quiz.